Hello, everyone. It's really great to be here. And I'll just say quickly in advance that I'm not really working on intoxicants per se in my project, but the conference's call for paper kind of motivated me to think about the intoxicant aspect of my PhD, um, uh, which I will now be happy to share with you, and I hope to hear your thoughts afterwards. Um, and I will start right away. Um, a diaspora can be defined as a group of people who have migrated from one common place of origins to more than one destination, usually while maintaining some attachment to their homeland. The word diaspora in this sense refers originally to the Jewish experience after the biblical exile from the land of Israel. Yet the Jewish diaspora, of course, has never been really one diaspora, but consisted of many movements in many directions, many dispersions centered around many homelands. In this talk, I will deal with two such diasporas within a diaspora, to quote a book titled by Jonathan Israel, namely the dispersion of mostly Baghdadi Jews in East Asia and of mostly Yemeni Jews at the Horn of Africa as they emerged during the 19th and 20th centuries. Although these diasporas were modest in size, each counting just a few hundred souls, they help, I think they help shed light on the more profane aspects of the Jewish experience, as well as emphasize general non-Jewish processes. The migration of these Jews and the formation of these diasporas have usually been explained through the local context of the place of origin. So the immigration of Jews from Baghdad in the 19th century, for example, has been traced to their persecution by the Ottomans, combined with frequent wars, plagues, and other disasters in Baghdad. Similar factors have been observed in Yemen, where the constant wars of the local imams, accompanied by famine and persecution, drove many Yemeni Jews to seek better life elsewhere. Now, notwithstanding the importance of these push factors, in this presentation, I would like to emphasize the pull factors. So what attracted Jewish immigrants to these specific destinations. In order to do so, I will concentrate on two Jewish merchant dynasties, the Sassoon and the Menachem families, and will follow the commodities that drove their movement, namely opium and coffee, respectively. So David Sassoon was born in Baghdad in 1793 to a powerful Jewish family. In 1830, during the persecution by the Ottoman Pasha of Baghdad, he and his family left the city, eventually arriving in Bombay in 1832 and settling down at the fort at the colonial quarter. Sassoon quickly integrated into the local economy of Bombay by buying opium from the hinterland and selling it for export. Until 1833, a monopoly of the East India Company prevented Sassoon and other local merchants from trading directly with China, which was by then becoming the largest consumer of Indian opium by far. Even after the East India Company's monopoly was dismantled in 1833 and the trade was liberalized, the heavy Chinese restrictions on foreign opium trade still limited the business scope of David Sassoon and Company, who counted among the many British and Indian firms anxious to get stronger foothold in the Chinese market. In 1839, their anxiousness was finally fulfilled when violence broke between Britain and China. From a British point of view, the events that later became known as the First Opium War were meant to open China for free British trade. And the Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842, which concluded the war and reflected the British decisive victory over China, indeed opened several Chinese ports, which were now called treaty ports, for foreign merchants. And in practice, this treaty created extraterritorial enclaves in selected Chinese port cities where British merchants could now operate freely. David Sassoon wasted no time, and shortly after the signing of the treaty, dispatched his son Elias to explore opportunities east of the Raj. In Canton, then the opium capital, of China. Elias Sassoon was registered as early as 1845. He was quickly reinforced by his brothers and other Jewish employees sent from Bombay, who together set up branches and agencies in all major treaty ports, including Fuzhou, Shanghai, Xinjiang, Tianjin, and many others, as well as in Hong Kong, which was surrendered to full British sovereignty under the same Treaty of Nanking. These branches, manned by family members and trusted Jewish employees from India, proved terribly efficient in pushing opium into the Chinese markets, and Sassoon's profits were piling up rapidly in Bombay. By the 1880s, the Sassoon family, who split into two competing firms, controlled together about 70% of the entire Indo-Chinese opium trade. Opium merchants established at the treaty ports were isolated in their small extraterritorial enclaves and surrounded by increasingly hostile Chinese population. Sassoon's business was thus very much dependent on British fleets and on British Indian policemen to protect his enterprise at sea and at land. In October 1856, when an alleged desecration of the British flag by Chinese officials escalated into a second opium war, Sassoon's offices in Canton were burned to the ground, and the firm had to leave the city forever. In Xinjiang and in other places, Chinese merchant guilds issued bans on the Sassoons, eventually driving them again out of these ports. So as most treaty ports were becoming increasingly hostile, the Sassoons concentrated their efforts wherever they could find stability and safety. Hong Kong, which came under full British sovereignty, offered an ideal haven to British Indian opium merchants. And as it grew as the most important opium gateway to China, the Sassoons made it their main headquarters in East Asia, and they and their employees began spending longer periods in the colony, some of them gradually bringing their families with them. Such longer sojourn required appropriate facilities. So in 1858, the Sassoons leased land for a Jewish cemetery in Hong Kong and set an improvised synagogue, which was in 1809 replaced by the magnificent Oelea synagogue, named after Elias Sassoon's wife, which we can see in this picture. In Shanghai as well, which unlike Hong Kong never really came under direct British rule, but it did rise as like this main arena for business with China. The Sassoons also concentrated their efforts and employed dozens of employees in their firms, for whom they again provided with these facilities. So a Jewish cemetery, a paid rabbi, and a synagogue, again named after a late Sassoon woman, Oel Rachel, after Rachel Sassoon. In Singapore, the British fortress on the Strait of Malacca, the Sassoons never really established a permanent office, but they employed representatives among those who had arrived before them. Singapore functioned as an entrepot from which Indian opium was distributed across East and Southeast Asian ports, and the Jewish opium merchants of Arabian descent, mostly from Calcutta, had settled in the colony since the 1840s, and they were actually transshipping much of the Sassoon's opium from India further east to China. And here in Singapore, it was the opium magnate Menachem, born in Baghdad and raised in Calcutta, who patronized the growing Jewish merchant community and erected the Chesed El synagogue in 1905. From Singapore to Hong Kong to Shanghai, the Sassoons employed dozens of Jewish men, most of them hired in Bombay and Kolkata before sent eastwards. Increasingly, after having gained experience in these East Asian ports, these Jewish employees would break up with the Sassoons and start off as independent merchants and brokers. Among the famous ex-Sassoon employees, one could mention Eli Kaduri of Hong Kong or Silas Khaldun of Shanghai, both of whom made fortunes in the stock market and in real estate rather than in opium, and both subsequently assumed the role of leaders of the local juries in Hong Kong and in Shanghai, juries that counted the hundreds of people in the first decades of the 20th century. So what started as remote trade outposts of opium merchants gradually developed into thriving and diverse Jewish communities. By the time the Indo-Chinese opium trade was finally abolished in 1817, these communities were already independent of opium, and they were engaged in a variety of other fields and professions and trades. And they were also independent of the Sassoons, who had by then largely retreated from East Asia and settled in Britain. A similar process of these like trade offices that grow into Jewish communities could also be observed on the other side of the Indian Ocean. And now I turn to Aden. Although located on the remote Arabian Peninsula, Aden had been part of the British Empire since its conquest by the East India Company in 1839. It had a small native Jewish community with many Jews migrating to the city from Yemen after the British occupation. And since 1864, this community was led by Banin Menachem, an Aden-born merchant whose father had worked for the East India Company. As Aden's trade was booming after the inauguration of the Suez Canal in 1869, Banin Menachem commercial firm, Menachem Company, was booming with it. Already since its occupation, the British destined Aden to take over the coffee trade from the nearby ports, most significantly from the port of Al-Mukha or Mocha, and to become the region's largest coffee exporter. Banin Menachem saw where the wind was blowing, and using his thick network in the Yemeni hinterland, he began importing coffee beans from the interior to Aden and to sell it at the port. He quickly became one of the wealthiest men in the colony, known not only as the Rothschild of Arabia, but also as the king of coffee. While Banin Menachem managed to monopolize the coffee flowing from Yemen down to Aden, he had no control back then over the markets on the opposite African side of the Red Sea. And from the late 19th century, Ethiopia steadily increased its opium production and export, and attracting ever more merchants to explore business opportunities there in Ethiopia. So like David Sassoon in Bombay, Banin Menachem in Aden did not miss this chance, and he sent his agents to start buying coffee on the African side of the Red Sea. At least since the 1880s, Menachem's agents, almost all of them Yemeni Jews from Aden, were traveling to the emporia on the Somali coast to acquire coffee brought from the African interior. Like with the hostile Chinese treaty ports, these agents described the dangers of trading in those rough areas of Somalia, and they returned back to Aden as often as they could. Only when the small town of Djibouti was developed as a primary port of the French Empire in the region, the Menachem Company finally opened a permanent office on the African continent. The Djibouti office was most probably located on the Rue de Rome, where a small synagogue was established to serve Menachem's agents. Around this office, which also included some residential apartments, clustered other Jewish Yemeni artisans, peddlers, hawkers, refugees, and by 1932, this small community numbered already 400 souls. Like the British in Aden, France destined Djibouti to become its main hub in the Red Sea region and to serve as a gateway for the entire import and export of the neighboring landlocked Ethiopian empire. To increase this trade, a French company won a concession to lay a rail connecting Djibouti to Addis Ababa, the new Ethiopian capital up on the highland. Work on this railroad was slow, and it took long years before it finally reached Addis Ababa. But in the meantime, a temporary terminus was established in 1902 in Dire Dawa, in the middle of the Ethiopian wilderness, so to speak. In this small market town that emerged really almost ex nihilo as an arbitrary result of the work on the railway, the Menachem Mesa company opened another branch around which again a small colony of Jewish Yemeni merchants, peddlers, and other immigrants crystallized. In 1817, the railway finally reached Addis Ababa and connected it to the port of Djibouti. By then, the Menachem Mesa company had already been long established in the Ethiopian capital. Already in 1900, Benin Menachem Mesa bought land in Addis Ababa and founded a commercial compound there that would later bear his name, the Benin Sefer. Far away from Aden, when the train was still nowhere in sight, the Benin Sefer needed to accommodate Menachem Mesa's employees for long sojourns. Beside offices, warehouses, and the yard where Ethiopian merchants unloaded their coffee beans, the Benin Sefer included also a small synagogue, a kosher slaughterhouse, and several residential apartments. Increasingly, Menachem Mesa's employees settled with their wives and children in this compound, and around it gathered over 20 Jewish families. Long after the demise of the Menachem Mesa company in the 1930s, the Benin Sefer continued to serve as the heart of a Jewish community, which was no longer associated with the Menachem Mesa family. Shalom Shelemai, another Aden-born merchant, made the Benin Sefer his headquarters in the 1940s and led the community all the way to the 1970s, as he continued to trade in hides, spices, and of course in Ethiopian coffee. So at the Horn of Africa, like in East Asia, what started as small trade offices gradually developed into small but flourishing Jewish communities, which eventually outgrown their original purpose. These communities maintained their attachment to Aden, which remained the social, cultural, and religious center for Yemeni Jews abroad, just like the communities in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Shanghai maintained their ties to India. We therefore can speak of new diasporas within a diaspora, new Jewish satellite communities centered around new homelands. These diasporas, as I try to demonstrate so far, were a direct result of new commercial constellations. So as coffee beans were flowing on the new railway from Addis Ababa to Dire Dawa and to Djibouti, Jewish Yemeni merchants established themselves on each station of that trade route. In East Asia, as opium was making its way from India to China, Jewish Baghdadi merchants settled on the key links of the opium route, namely in Singapore, in Hong Kong, and in Shanghai. Their diasporas then clearly took the shape of new commercial spaces formed by empires, be it through the treaty port system in China or the French railway between Ethiopia and Somalia, and of course the development of imperial ports such as Singapore and Djibouti. But besides the imperial infrastructure, it was very much the flow of specific commodities that shaped the contours of these new Jewish diasporas, whether the sites of production of these commodities, as in the case of Ethiopian coffee, or the sites of consumption, as in the case of opium in China. That these were intoxicating commodities, so highly addictive, highly desired, and highly profitable, made the impetus all the more irresistible. In that, the booming demand for opium and coffee had far-reaching consequences for many Jewish merchants who followed the commodities to places where no Jewish communities existed before, and they formed diasporas that might have never emerged otherwise. These intoxicating diasporas might be defined as a Jewish Aden diaspora or Bombay diaspora according to their place of origin, but also, and with that suggestion, I would like to conclude. We might consider these diasporas according to their specialized commodity as a Jewish coffee diaspora or a Jewish opium diaspora. And I think I will stop here. And yeah, thank you.